What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Ramblings of a Sea. I'm your host Amar Singh, and we're here once again to dive deep into the rabbit hole of history. Today we're taking a journey into the heart of Punjabi history, exploring the rich tapestry of music and culture that has shaped the region and in turn shaped the world. We're privileged to have with us Dr. Radha Kapuria, an assistant professor specializing in South Asian history and the author of Music in Colonial Punjab, Courtesans, Bards and Connoisseurs, 1800 to 1947. Dr. Kapuria is here to share her insights into the evolution of Punjabi music during the colonial period, the influence of courtesans, bards and connoisseurs, as well as the lasting impact of this crucial era on contemporary Punjabi music. But before we dive in, let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered why the period between 1800 and 1947 is so significant? Or how the British colonial administration impacted the preservation and transformation of traditional Punjabi music? What about the role of gender and caste in the Punjabi musical landscape of the time? Well, stay tuned because we're about to unravel all of this and a lot more. We'll be discussing the intriguing stories of Bibi Mora and Gul Begum, both courtesans and Muslim wives of Ranjit Singh. We'll also look at how the role of courtesans drastically changed over a roughly 150-year period. We'll be debunking myths and uncovering truths like the real story behind Ranjit Singh and the origins of Phul Kanjri. So, if you're ready to embark on a journey of historical revelations and musical wonders, make sure to watch this until the end, hit like, leave a comment, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future journeys down the rabbit hole of history.
So I come from Delhi originally, and I was born in a Punjabi family who were displaced during partition. So my grandparents were all born in West Punjab. So I grew up in Delhi in India, but I grew up with stories of a home that was lost and cultural memory, which kind of united us with Pakistani Punjabis. So it was a very interesting way to grow up because there was a lot of um, hurt and anger towards the other community. So I grew up in a Hindu family, so there was a lot of hurt towards Muslims, and that came from the legacy of partition. Whereas at the same time, there was these cultural ties which connected us to Pakistani culture, and the same grandmother who could be wild towards Muslims would also enjoy Pakistani plays. And we heard the same, we heard Musarrat Nazir's tappe playing at weddings in Delhi in our homes. So both these coexisted, and it made me very curious to understand the life of music, because music is something and songs really connect us.
That is amazing. One thing that caught my eye was that obviously the title says Music in Colonial Punjab, and it covers the period from 1800 to 1947. Now, most people probably listening to this, when they think of colonial Punjab, think of it under the British Raj, and obviously 1800 is just before it gets annexed. So, I guess my question is, why did you choose that time period, and what does it cover in terms of what does the book trace over that period of time?
Actually, now have a copy of the book, which I can. The last time you were meant to speak, this hadn't arrived, so I finally have my author copies, and it's a great feeling. It was Music in Colonial Punjab was meant to be the subtitle, but the publishers wanted it to be the main title then. And I think that's just a broad period of 1800 to 1947. But I think my intention was to look at pre-partition Punjab, and obviously this is already a very huge swathe of time. It's it's almost 150 years. Which is already beyond most research gamuts, and which is why I don't cover everything. It's not possible to. But I thought I would just do a bit of background on Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court, because that is what predated colonialism. But it turned out that there was so much material that no one had cared to look at for the Ranjit Singh period that I ended up doing a whole chapter on Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And now others like Kirit James Singh, who's finished his PhD recently at SOAS, has done a whole PhD on Sikh music during Ranjit Singh's era and other such themes. So it's really exciting to have discovered all that. And so, research is a kind of unexpected, unpredictable journey.
Just you mentioning Maharaja Ranjit Singh, I'm sure there's so much that you could tell us about, but kind of what are some of the standout characteristics that you would maybe standout kind of facts that you researched just during kind of Ranjit Singh's period related to music, etc.?
Well, I think at the outset, the obvious has to be stated, which is to say that he was a very, profoundly interested connoisseur of the arts, and of music and dance in particular. He used to listen to ragis and rawabis, and equally used to listen to bards and tawaif singing and dancing on a daily basis. So it was integral to his routine, in a sense, his daily life. But it was also important to his political life. So performances by his very, highly trained and highly well endowed, well remunerated courtesans was part of every political negotiation with all his political rivals, especially with the European rivals like the English East India Company. So this was also curious that these courtesans were ubiquitous. They were everywhere in the record on Ranjit Singh, and yet, the only way in which they had been written about so far was to vilify Ranjit Singh and say, oh, he's just interested in wine and notchkas, and he's not serious. But actually, if you look at the Persian court chronicles, which I read in translation in English, it shows you that these courtesans and their performances were integral to putting up the spectacle of the Sikh state and to represent the martial glory of the Khalsa Raj to outsiders, to whether it's French scientists or Transylvanian physicians or English politicians visiting the Lahore Darbar. So that in itself was an important thing to highlight, and to also say that there are records of him gifting handsome jagirs or land grants to the courtesans. So these were powerful women, independent women. He even married two courtesans who were Muslim, and so they kind of was happy for them to continue practicing their faith, and they became patrons of schools of learning. And it was a very cosmopolitan time. This is what really excited me about the Ranjit Singh period. Like, while he was the first Sikh ruler and established the first Sikh empire, there was a lot of eclecticism at his court. And when you look at his sort of love stories with the two courtesan wives, Bibi Mora and Gul Begum, you find this very clearly, because Bibi Mora also, she donated to temples, but she also, as a practicing Muslim, she built mosques and she donated to Islamic schools of learning. So there was, and again, this is something which would surprise people, not on account of the Sikh Muslim thing, but on account of just courtesans being interested in religion. Because in today's perspective, we look at courtesans as, again, through an immoral lens. We see them simply as being sensuous or, concerned with the pleasures of the senses and the body. But there was a connection during this period and before it with the sacred as well. And that's something we have forgotten. And I hope that my book can hopefully revise our views about that.
You've kind of already answered the next question I want to ask you, but I just kind of want to go a little bit deeper, which is obviously there's this, I guess, it's a misunderstanding of Ranjit Singh's period and of kind of the role dancers played in the court per se. And obviously, as you've already said, a lot of it is viewed as being kind of almost derogatory or kind of almost, there's almost an assumption that it's almost pornographic. It's almost kind of, it's so what is it? Yeah, dirty, and it's kind of like it's subhuman almost. Now, to a lot of people listening who may have a better understanding of history, they may kind of see through that, which is obviously the British writing at the time are kind of, there's this myth of them civilizing all of these different cultures, and obviously Ranjit Singh being painted as this kind of debauched king who's interested in all this weird and crazy dance obviously helps fulfill that.
Yeah.
How much of that is the case?
I don't think, actually, I think it's almost entirely the kind of florid and very excessively, sort of vivid details about Ranjit Singh being super drunk and indulging in pleasures of the flesh and of having alcohol, and some of these people say he gave us liquid fire. So in a sense, there was this propensity to see both as evidence of his of basically the trope of the Orientalist monarch, the Orientalist debauched monarch, who needs to be, therefore we need to come and replace him, and he is not fit to rule. So that is the underlying message, and that was there in not in all European writing, only a few, but it was especially John Lawrence kind of wrote these kinds of things, and they became very Henry Lawrence popularized it, and some others picked it up. But it isn't true in the sense, this kind of overtly excessive indulgence, of pleasures of the flesh and of alcohol. Instead, what we find is that we find courtesans in very serious settings. They were part of state procedure. They were seen as, fulfilling an important political role. And this is something which the English or the other Europeans, with their very with a very Western mindset, and with also like increasingly Victorian notions later on in the 19th century, tended to view this as a sign of immorality. And they could not see South Asian notions of, how do you start something auspicious? And courtesans would always be there to mark any auspicious occasion, not just in terms of politics and political diplomacy and statecraft, but also in personal life, right? Whenever there was a walk or a wedding, it would be marked by inviting courtesans and groups of courtesans to come and sing at your home. And at many of the Sufi shrines and many of the, sacred shrines in the Mela cultures of Punjab, often courtesans would not just be invited, but they were permanent sort of fixtures at the annual Urs or the festivals. They would sing and dance. This is again something that has been forgotten because of this association with immorality. And then, which is something I can discuss a bit later, in the late 19th century, the Punjabis and the Indians themselves took on this Victorian worldview, the reformers, and they led a sort of anti-nautch campaign to abolish the nautch. So when all of this happens, it's these communities of performing women, hereditary performing female communities are the ones who lose out. And the alarming thing is that even the memory of them being present in public spaces has been erased. And I mean, Ranjit Singh was, he died in 1839, which is less than 200 years ago. So compared to so many other periods of European history, it's very recent, right? And there's so much which is preserved and written about in European history, but in South Asia, there's been so much cultural change that we've not been able to capture that. So I think that was also one of the motivations to do this research.
No, definitely. And I'm sure there's lots of people, not just me, who are glad that you have done that, because the work is amazing. You have spoken obviously about how, and I'm sure we'll get into it further on, about how kind of cultural attitudes have changed and how that's affected not just how we remember dance in Punjab and through history, but also kind of it was then eternalized and kind of had its own role. But putting that to one side for a second, considering Punjab goes through such changes from 1800, 47 years or 48 years later, then it gets annexed, and there's 100 years old under British rule, which is obviously riddled with all sorts of events such as Jallianwala Bagh and other factors which really would have drastically changed any socio-political landscape. How does, I guess that's a large space of time, but briefly, like, how do those changes in socio-political factors impact kind of the roles of courtesans, bards, connoisseurs, and like music. Obviously, I'm sure there were huge, like massive changes, but like what are some that you could share?
So the original subtitle for my book was From Pulkanjri to Patiala. Music in colonial Punjab from Pulkanjri to Patiala. But then I thought, most people will not know what Pulkanjri is. So I changed it to courtesans, bards, and connoisseurs. Um, and Pulkanjri, or Tawaif Pul, as it was known in Ranjit Singh's era, was this bridge which he built for Bibi Mora, who went on to become his first courtesan wife. And there is a lovely story about why he built it for her. She was from Amritsar, so when he would go from Lahore to Amritsar, he would stop on the way to meet her, and she would perform for him. But there was a sort of canal she had to cross on horseback on the way to this meeting place. And one day, her silver slipper apparently fell into the canal, and she was really upset. And she said to him that if you don't build a bridge here for me to cross safely, I will never perform for you again. So that's the story behind the building of the bridge. And soon, over time, she established a sort of sarovar for travelers who could come and drink water, a sarai, which is a traveler's house. And she, of course, as a Muslim, built a mosque. There's a Sikh shrine there. There is a Shiv Hindu temple. So again, it's very eclectic. Even today, this is on the Wagah border today between India and Pakistan. So I think Pulkanjri was built sometime in the early 19th century, and it sort of fell into ruin with the collapse of the Sikh state, and with the coming of colonialism. And one of the people who was, we know how Rani Jinda was vilified, the youngest queen of Ranjit Singh, who stood up to the East India Company. She was called the dancing girl as well. So the British used this phrase, this terminology, to also vilify and attach a negativity to people who resisted. But one of her right-hand women was Mangla, who was also a dancing girl, and she had the keys to the Toshakhana, the treasury. She had a lot of power, and as Priya Dwal shows, in her work on gender and the Sikh Empire, one of the first things that Henry Lawrence did was to, pension off and sort of send her away to the hills, like send Mangla away, because she had that power. But Ranjit Singh's second courtesan wife, Gul Begum, had one of the most handsome pensions which the East India Company gave amongst all his wives, because she had that power while he was alive. And they could see how she could be a potential thorn in their side, like Rani Jinda was. So they ensured they gave her like the 12,000 rupees a year pension at that time. So that just shows you an inkling of how powerful courtesans could be. So from that to the book ends in roughly 1947, there was a massive shift from the power of female performers, and especially courtesans, to this sense of very diminished role of courtesans, and in a sense, the privileging of male virtuosic singers as the face of classical music, which is what we see today, and that's the reformed version of Indian classical music that we are familiar with. And that happened during this time because female singers were very powerful and very respected, not just as dancers, but as vocalists and also as teachers. So they had that status in society, and this kind of crumbled over this time. So that's one thing which happened. And so they are the group that loses out the most, which is why I keep harping on them a little bit. But also, I think the Mirasis, the community of the bards, they also saw many shifts. Now, I'm by in a sense, by laying the blame at the feet of European colonizers, I'm not going to minimize the blame that we as South Asians ourselves, need to take on for the sort of casteist prejudice towards performing communities. So Mirasi is seen as a term of abuse in many Punjabi communities, even today, or Kanjar is seen as a term of abuse.
Wow. I've obviously heard of the latter word, and that's used widely within the Punjabi community to be derogatory towards women. I've never like, and this might just be because of the fact that like I'm in England rather than like a more diverse Punjabi community, but I've never actually heard of the first term being used derogatory.
I think if you look at interviews of even famous Bollywood actors like Ayushmann Khurrana, he'll tell you that when he wanted to do perform as an actor, one of the things that his grandmother said is "Mirasiyan wale kam karne." You don't have to do the and this kind of this term has been used at many people who are outside or who are upper caste and who want to pursue music. And there's often this family opprobrium saying, you don't have to do the work of Mirasis. And especially, I think it's especially very prominent in Pakistan, mainly because at 1947, the bulk of Punjabi Muslims migrated or had to migrate. And the Mirathis are they're the syncretic community, but they identify primarily as Muslim, even though they can sing bhajans, and the Rababi community are also Muslim, but as we know, they sing Shabad Kirtan. So these communities, even though the Mirasis basically identify as Muslim, but they would service different communities. As musicians, they would have the skills to sing different things for all these different communities. So I think for the Mirasis, it was an interesting time. I mean, traditionally, Mirasis have been vilified by Punjabis themselves, by upper caste Punjabis. But I think in some ways, maybe in contrast to what the courtesans faced, the Mirasis saw a volume of interest in their skills and in their knowledge in the colonial period. And this is ironic, and it's because the colonial scholar administrators were deeply interested in folklore. So people like Richard Temple and Flora Annie Steele, all of these people have written Legends of Punjab and many others, Charles Finnett. So they would all go to the Mirasis to collect these stains. And very few of them, though, again, there is a disrespect to the Mirasi, very few were interested in the Mirasis themselves. All they were interested in was capturing the folk tales, because in the late 19th century, there was a craze with folklore, which translated, which was there in Europe as well. There was an interest in the folklore of Europe and the old folk songs, etc. So that's where the Mirasis had all these Englishmen and English women, or Scotsmen and Scotswomen, depending on who was posted, going to them and recording these folk songs. So the Mirasis were, in a sense, were sought out. And then with the coming up of Indian middle-class families allowing their children or wanting their children to learn music, often Mirasis would also be employed to teach middle-class children the basics of Rag. So this is something I found that Mr. Ashwini Kumar, who ran the Harvandab Music Festival of Jalandhar in East Punjab, he grew up in Lahore, and his father was one of the first doctors to go and study in England from Punjab, apparently. And he was very fond of music, and he employed a Mirasi just to teach all his three children the basics of Rag. Now, the Mirasis are very interesting because they are seen as folk musicians, but they had the knowledge, the basics of classical music. And so, which is why a Mirasi could teach you Rag, but maybe because they were not literate in English or in the maybe the high vernacular, they couldn't probably explain Rag to especially English people or Europeans who were trying to understand Indian music. So someone like Annie Wilson, who's a Scotswoman who goes around trying to learn Indian music, the first person who teaches her is a Mirasi, Gulab Muhammad, and she keeps learning from him. But it's not until she meets this, this reformer, this modernizer of music, Pandit Police, who is from he's from Maharashtra, and he comes to Lahore and sets up his first school, the Gandhar Mahavidyalaya, and he had a very Hindu devotional vision for music. So it's only he can speak in English and he can explain it to a European mind. So she understands it thanks to Paluskar, but the basics have been taught to her by a Mirasi. So Mirasis were in this very fascinating position where they was sought out by many people. And what's interesting is that how much ever the Arya Samaji Hindu reformers, they later on, they did a lot of like uh, Hindu mission work through music. Very much like the Christian missionaries who were also doing, again, everyone was going to the Mirasis because these are the guys who could sing. So to disseminate their music, to the masses and to compete with this Christian missionary style of evangelical work, you need to go to Mirasis. So the first singers of bhajans in the 1870s in Arya Samaj gatherings in Lahore were Mirasis, and this was something that an English commentator remarked upon with great, oh my God, how is there a non-believer? These are what he said, quote unquote, Mohammedan singers. So this is the kind of culture of Punjab that we have inherited, this syncretic, mishmash of identities, and music and musicians are a great group to research because they constantly subvert those borders and those, bounds of identity.
We've spoken kind of briefly about Marasis, Rawabis, courtesans, and for those listening, they may be kind of scratching their heads in terms of like, what role do these musicians play and how do they differ? Because for me, Marasis and Rawabis kind of sound or seem the same, but I'm sure they're very different. So, like, if you don't mind, in just like a couple of sentences, kind of like, what are the origins of the courtesans and what are their kind of primary functions? And equally with Marasis and Rawabis, like, you have already kind of briefly mentioned it, but just to kind of consolidate for everyone listening.
So at the outset, I should say that there were no fixed labels, and these labels change over time. And Mirasi is a term that becomes popular at this time in the 19th century. The work of Daniel Newman, who did some of the earliest research in the 70s on Indian music, shows us that, and so many others like Lowell Leiberger and Michael Nijavan and Balbir Singh Kanwal, who is an infant, they've all kind of shown that originally the term was dhadi, and over time it became, in Punjab, it became Mirasi. But often Mirasi and Rababi could be used interchangeably. I think perhaps Rababi is, very explicitly connected to the instrument, the rabab, whereas Mirasis are just a general community. And I think if you were born in a Mirasi family, you would know how to do vocal singing for sure. Whereas, and if you're a boy, you would also be taught instruments. So I think Rababis would be specialists in playing the rabab and also singing Shabad Kirtan, whereas Mirasis would be just more generally the community as well. But I think over time, I think the Rababis became their own kind of subcaste as well. So that's the Mirasis. And the courtesans there were two categories: the Tawaif, who were more elite, and Kanjars, or the Kanjaris, who were more subaltern, more low status. And I think the Kanjaris would be the common dancing girls on the street, and whose functions could double up as providing sexual services as well. And sometimes they would often be accompanied by Mirasis playing the instruments while they danced, and the Mirasis singing while they danced. Whereas the elite courtesans were Tawaif. There were so many of them at Ranjit Singh's court and at other courts like Patiala. So these are the categorizations. And again, I think connoisseurs are interesting, and especially in Punjab, because usually you think that classical rag music is appreciated only by an aristocratic or elite connoisseur. But in Punjab, we find that actually there was a popular appetite for music and all kinds of music. So these distinctions that we have today of folk music and classical did not exist in the same way at that time. I mean, the fact that you sang rag at a certain time in the darbar of a king, that concept existed. But if you went to a popular performance, there would be all kinds of things being performed. And in fact, Drupad was very popular. There used to be Drupad melas that people would go to listen to. So at Harwallabh, which I mentioned before in Jalandhar in East Punjab, it started as a Drupad mela, and there were performers of Drupad in Punjab who were quite skilled who would come and sing there. There's another strand of Sikh music called Partal Gaiki, which derives from Drupad. So Drupad and Bhai Baldeep Singh's work shows this very clearly, how Drupad was also popular, and there was an appetite for this. So in terms of genres of music, Drupad was also kind of displaced by Khayal, which was shorter. Drupad is a very long, languorous kind of format, and this by Baldeep Singh and others have already shown this. So that's how. So connoisseurs also in Punjab were common people were also quite interested in music and were connoisseurs. And this is again, I think, and we have partition to blame for these ideas that Punjabis are very boorish or loud and they don't understand high culture. Again, I mean, these are notions that come from other regions of India, where, say, in Bengal, there is a tradition of, taste in music and elites patronizing music, and again in Maharashtra, Bombay. But Punjab had a different story, and I think there was this popular appetite for music, which is something that we have, over time, is a memory that's been lost.
Which nicely kind of leads us on to the next question, which is how does the legacy of music in colonial Punjab influence contemporary Punjabi music?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think more than I think the immediate impact which we can see on our music is more post-colonial, but of course, post-colonial had its roots in the colonial. So what I mean by that is that in the post-colonial era, there was this division over time which emerged by the 60s or 70s between Indian Punjabi and Pakistani Punjabi music. And so Virinder Kalra and others have shown how in Indian Punjab, because the state was interested in upholding this idea of folk music was patronized by the state and became the kind of image of Punjabi music amongst Indian Punjabis and in India. And this is the root of this idea of Punjab as a folk land and an agricultural land also goes back to colonialism. So, the canal colonies and the way in which a lot of big parts of Punjab were brought under agriculture is something, and this notion of Punjab being very folk and very rural and rural idyll was something that the East India Company and others wanted to perpetuate. And Navjog Gill has argued, he's a wonderful scholar who's argued that there was literally an attempt to convert swords into plowshares. So this martial Sikh identity, to convert it into a very rustic Jat, and this hardy peasant image. So that image is something that was rigidified, solidified in the colonial period, and that shows up in the Indian Punjabi musical setting, right? So folk music, which is great. We have a very rich tradition of folk music, and I'm not trying to put that down, but I'm just trying to say that there is a lot more to musical traditions of Punjab. And in Pakistan, because of the sort of Islamic roots of Pakistani identity, the Qawwali music became the kind of genre which took precedence over all others. So these two even today, and of course, if you go to gurdwaras and you're practicing Sikh and you enjoy listening to kirtan, so it's these three genres that kind of represent Punjab in a sense, and in a sense, they, to the detriment of rag music and these very Punjabi versions of rag dari music or Punjabi gharanas, which seem to be fighting to survive in some ways. So I think that's the kind of evolution of what happened with music. And as I said, partition had a lot to do with us forgetting this history of Ragdari music in Punjab.
We briefly spoke about kind of the role that music played under Dinjit Singh's period earlier on, and I guess we've now kind of jumped ahead into like kind of the modern day. But during the British Raj, during the bit in the middle, how did the British administration impact the preservation and transformation of Punjabi music, whatever that might be, whether that is courtesans or like the courtesans on the corner or Marasis or the Babis or whatever? Like, how are the British, or what role do the British play in influencing this type of music? Obviously, you spoke earlier about how there's a lot of people during the 19th century turning up and talking to Marasis and getting these folk stories and taking them back home. But like, what are other ways perhaps which the British administration in whatever form influences music?
So I think, yeah, I did speak about the wider social impact on, as you said, on worldviews, and how the sense of seeing these traditional musician and Tawaif communities as negative is something that we owe to colonialism. But the single most visible impact of colonialism is, of course, the harmonium, which has now been Indianized, but it came to Punjab through Christian mission work and was adapted then and was adopted by the Punjabis and then taken and then Indianized in a sense. So the harmonium we use today is not the Western instrument that arrived 200 years ago or whenever, so it's not the same, but it did arrive with Christian mission work. So I think there was this, one of the most direct impacts has been through the attempt of Christian missionaries to engage with Punjabi music. And as a scholar, we can have debates about the ethics and the morality of evangelical work, and all of that is separate. But I think it led to some very interesting and productive cultural exchange as well. So there is a very rich tradition of Punjabi Zaboor, which started in this period, like the 1880s. There was a man called Imaduddin Shahbaz, Reverend I.D. Shahbaz, who was a very prominent Punjabi Christian who helped to write the Psalms in Punjabi, the Christian Psalms. And there are very thriving Punjabi Christian communities from mainly from West Punjab and Pakistan, but also in India, who still sing those Zaboor. And in fact, I live in Manchester, and my beautician is Punjabi Christian, and she talks about how the services on Sunday are the singing is all in Punjabi, even though many of the sort of Desi Christians who go are not Punjabi. They speak in Urdu, but the singing is all in Punjabi because of the work of I.D. Shahbaz. And of course, he worked with the sort of white missionaries who wanted to convert it into Indian languages. And interestingly, even amongst the missionaries who wanted to make these songs Punjabi, it was women. It was white women who were at the forefront of converting it into Punjabi and trying to make it more palatable to local people. Whereas most of the time, the majority of white missionary men were not interested in, they were against this idea of, it was seen as a heathenization of message, right? So, but these women were the ones who were going and connecting with the musicians. And so I found that really interesting. That is also there in the chapter on colonialism. So Punjabi Zaboor is a very rich legacy of that time. And even across, I think I've heard Indian Christian churches, Zaboor is known and it's sung in Punjabi because we had this huge creative output.
That's amazing. It's kind of insane when you think of like the results of some of these exchanges. Like you would never have necessarily guessed. I had a question that's now completely slipped my mind. And it was really interesting, I promised. God. Anyway, hopefully it'll come back to it and then I'll be able to... Oh, yeah, sorry, it's come back. Obviously, post-partition, and I guess the origins of this are pre-partition with colonialism, but there's this drive towards and the British are obviously pivotal in this, which there's a drive towards connecting like one religion with one language and kind of Hinduism with Hindi and Punjabi with Sikhs, etc. It wasn't one of the questions that I had prepared, but just as we're talking, like, and you were just discussing how the work of this one man writing the Psalms of Punjabi still has an impact today within Christian Punjabi communities. It then made me wonder, what role did that kind of emphasis of one religion, one language have on the development and also the understanding of music? Because even today, like, even when you're talking, like, I'm sat here going, I didn't know literally any of this in relation to Punjabi cultural music.
Yeah.
Rababis are kind of heard of, obviously, because of Bhai Mardana. Rag Kirtan we've heard of, obviously, because like the Sikhs,
Yeah.
and that's just kind of natural. Qawwali, obviously, because of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan being probably the biggest Punjabi export
Yes.
in the, like, I don't know, since Sidhu Moosewala, really. So,
Yeah.
so like, putting that all to one side, how does that kind of agenda of one language, one religion play into the evolution of, or the changing of music and its role in Punjab?
No, it's a really, really good question. In fact, the singer-scholar Dr. Madan Gopal Singh, who's in Delhi, who's really amazing, has posed this question to me to say, whatever has happened to all the Punjabi Hindu bhajans, and that hits to the heart of your question on one language, one religion. And this was, again, as we know, in colonialism, there are stories of Punjabi Hindus being told by Arya Samaji reformers to tell the census official to say that my language is Hindi, not Punjabi, and they could not speak a word of Hindi, and they're telling the census official in Punjabi that Sadi Pasha Hindi hai. And today, and the negative legacy of that is today is my generation, who grew up with their parents speaking to us only in Hindi and English, and we can't speak fluent Punjabi in the same way. This is especially in India and in Pakistan, it's the same with Urdu and English. So many Punjabis are not speaking. But anyways, that's besides the point. I think this sense of different kinds of music to do with different communities isn't that what your question was?
Yeah. Basically, like, how you kind of partly answered it with the example of kind of how these Hindu bhajans have kind of disappeared from collective memory. But I guess in other ways, or are there any other ways perhaps that you could share with how this drive for one language, one religion, or at least that association has impacted music in Punjab?
Yeah. So some of the earliest Arya Samaji reformers was like, there was this woman, Mai Bhagwati, who preached in Hindi and wrote in Hindi, but she was Punjabi, and one of her first booklets was rewriting Sichniya and these songs which are very lusty and sung on weddings, women's songs, and repurposing them to pious and divine purposes. So she has written this entire booklet of songs for weak-minded women, which is the Punjab. It's the same melody. It's the Punjabi song. It's the Punjabi Sichni, but she's changed it into prayer for Paramatma, and So, so that's one thing that happened. But over time, it became that Hindus would only sing in Hindi. We still do have, of course, Punjabi Hindus singing some bhajans, but the memory of these older bhajans has kind of dwindled with this whole emphasis on one language, one religion. I think in the Punjabi Muslim context as well, I think in Pakistan they're alive, but there is a memory which of that kind of musical matrix that's forgotten, in India. Like, we may not think of Naat and there are so many other genres of Islamic music which were also sung in Punjabi, and those are also lost. So Qawwali is just one, right? There were so many others, like, the Shia Muslims and their on Muharram and the Marsiyas they sing. So there would be different kind of those in Punjabi as well. So there is a lot of research to be done. And those who are listening, especially in India and Pakistan, there's a lot more to be excavated and preserved, I think, especially by doing oral history and going out in the field and seeing what, and kind of reverse the agenda of the colonial scholar administrators who went mainly to record and just advance their careers, and to be like, as part of colonial governance. This is now an urgency to preserve these folk forms and these musical forms. Um, I just realized that I didn't answer your question on what's the impact on today's musicians and connoisseurs. I think one of the biggest impacts is this masculinity and this sort of idea of the male musician, which is something that has emerged through the course of the 20th century, I think. And this sense of, this very gender divide is something which we see in pop music. What we've forgotten are those Sawal Jawab duets, which often would be sung, which were popular, say, in the 70s or 80s. But today, because of the pop star and one single musician, it's become just one singer, right? Those other forms of Sawal Jawab music have been forgotten. Some of them are preserved in the Young India archive, which is at the British Library, which are these old gramophone records, where you have some of these singers who are doing these duets, which are so charming to listen to. So those are the old kinds of songs and genres which are not found today in today's pop music. We do see something new or alternative is in the rise of Chamar pop in India, where Ginni Mahi and others are positively embracing their Chamar identity, and they sing, songs like Danger Chamar and others. They actively champion their Chamar identity, because again, Chamar has been a term of vilification and abuse. And in Pakistan, you have songs like Main Marasi, which Hassan Nawaz and Zonaid Zahid have made, So there is this sense of, with social media, with more political awareness and sensitivity, people are destigmatizing these terms, which is great to see. So yeah, that's the impact on the present.
No. Thank you for both of those answers. Just kind of bringing back one of the questions that we said we'd discuss earlier. Well, we said we'd discuss it later on, but earlier on, which is now later on, if that makes sense. Which is obviously the role that, or the understanding of how society's viewing of gender and how that changes over time. So obviously we go from a period of highly respected, highly political, highly rich courtesans to a modern day view of I'd like almost a very derogatory view of women in that same role. And even looking back at these courtesans, even our modern day assumptions already are painting a particular image and a bias before we even actually look into it. What role does gender play, and how does that change? Because obviously it seems from the beginning it's almost a complete reversal to what we have now. Is that entirely down to colonialism? Obviously, you alluded earlier that we internalize a lot of the Victorian attitudes ourselves, and as a result, we've kind of continued colonialism to a degree. But like, what role does gender play, and kind of what's happening during this period?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I think I'll answer this based on, I can speak most, like the most detailed answer I can give is with regard to the Punjabi Hindus, mainly because there's a lot of discussion around gender and role of music when it comes to the Punjabi Hindus. And I'll speak about the Muslims and Sikhs also briefly, but mainly I think I mentioned Paluskar, who came from Maharashtra to Lahore, and he had this agenda for Hindu devotional music. And I spoke of Mai Bhagwati, who wrote these songs, who repurposed the Sichniya. But I think the aim of Paluskar was to make sure that middle-class, upper-caste Hindu women would learn how to sing and would sing bhajans and pious songs in public. And the only way that these people thought they can lure or attract middle-class women is by vilifying courtesans and vilifying mirasis and saying, oh, this is a Dev Vidya, or knowledge of God, and it's over time been sullied by these groups. Whereas in fact, these were the groups who had kept it alive and who were the possessors of this knowledge. And so you have women like Devki Sood, who becomes the first Punjabi woman to write a primer on music in Hindi from Amritsar in the 13th. So these are the kind of middle class women who then perform classical music and mostly connected to bhajan and temple context. So that becomes the kind of only context in which music is palatable, and especially for women to perform it. You have to show that you are married, middle class, pious woman if you want to perform in public, whether you perform bhajan or you perform classical music, right? So that becomes the defining parameters. And it's the only parameter in which women are legitimately allowed to perform. So that is the impact on gender. I mentioned earlier on how, moving to the Muslims, the only kind of real Punjab related evidence I could find, and I'm sure we can find more, it's just that I didn't have time to finish it in 3.5 years of PhD research. The evidence was there was a very unique bill in 1940s called the Music at Muslim Shrines Bill. And the only purpose of this bill was to outlaw female singers and female dancers from Sufi shrines, because it was seen as women's presence. And one of the people who spoke in the Punjab Legislative Assembly this was debated by Muslims mainly. And one of them, who was also a very deeply believing Muslim, he said, why don't we ban all musicians? Why do you want to keep the male musicians, but, throw out the female musicians? So he did raise that point. So again, gender becomes really important at this time. And that is tied to wider things, wider developments due to colonialism, which is a whole other story, right? So that's why this gender becomes deeply tied to music and performance of music. And in fact, there were debates on within how many miles radius can you allow female singers to be around the shrine. And then some people said, but if there's a wedding or a birth, people will invite courtesans to sing. You can't stop them from inviting them into their homes. So it was all these kinds of fascinating debates. And I think now we have, female kirtan singers coming out very visibly in many parts of the world, including in Indian Punjab. So it's growing now. There always were female Shabad singers, but again, it was less and muted. But I think it's now becoming more pronounced. So yeah, I think gender is definitely one of the most thorny issues when it comes to music and performance.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I'm not sure whether the rule is still enforced at Harmandir Sahib, but they didn't used to let female musicians. So I think it may still be the case. I'm not quite sure. I don't know whether it's changed, but last time I checked, they weren't allowing. And again, it goes against every grain in the Sikh ethos, right? Like, as in, it makes no sense whatsoever. But again, it's a fact, or it was something. I think it's still the case. I'm hoping it's changed, but I haven't checked, so don't hold me.
Debates recently, I remember there was
Yeah.
And then debated on the harmonium, certainly, I remember very recently. Yes.
I guess you already discussed how caste is being kind of almost re-owned, and it's being taken, it's almost, the identity is being almost taken in the hands of the people who it's being put on, rather than them allowing just to be labeled with it. They're almost defining it themselves. But you kind of briefly spoke about how a lot of these groups were almost castes in their own right. How does the role of caste impact then the development of music? Because obviously you've spoken just now about how it was turned by middle class women into something that was pious and rich and given all of these kind of positive Christian virtues. What role does caste play? And I guess we know where it ends, with people kind of re-owning it and taking it on their own terms. But how does it start and how does that develop?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think I'd be equipped to go back into time and say exactly how it started. But I think caste is such a, I mean, it's sad, but it's such an organizing principle of life on the subcontinent. And I think, speaking of the Mirasis, they were not just musicians, they were storytellers, and more importantly, they were also genealogists. So they used to keep the family genealogies, and often they would be responsible for setting up matches, like connecting families on weddings. So they had all these specialized roles to play in the functioning of village life. Uh, and So they had these three roles, right? Storytellers, genealogists, and musician. And musician and storyteller went hand in hand. So the fact that they were genealogists tells you about how powerful their oral memory was. And South Asia has very strong oral traditions, and communities like the Mirasis are at the heart of, uh, you know, preserving that. And I guess that's what these colonial administrators recognized in going for the Mirasis and collecting some of their stories. Um, and I think but at the same time, like I said, while they recognized how powerful the Mirasis are, at the same time, they didn't give them any agency or any sort of real voice in the stuff they published. And in fact, colonial policy, as we know, re-entrenched and made caste hierarchies even worse. So, for example, if you had to stand for municipal elections in Lahore in 1890s, you could not belong to a so-called lower caste. So you couldn't belong to a Mirasi or a Chamar or a Butcher or a Kanjar or any of these castes. So in some senses, colonialism pandered to upper caste prejudices as well. And that kind of has percolated down. But of course, in India now we have, after 47 and, Dr. Ambedkar, there was this attempt to, of course, untouchability is illegal, but it's still quite hard to fight and erase caste prejudice at this very everyday level. So I think that's how I would answer the question on caste. Five were not cast in the same way. So they, because the wife is a bit more open-ended as a category. You could be born into it. Your mother could be a Tawaif. But equally, there could be people who could join the profession. So it was not as dominated by birth as, say, being born into Mirasi caste was. So this is how I would answer the question on how caste affects musicians. Yes.
So is that, I guess, why then in the modern day people often say that one of Maharaj Ranjit Singh Ji's wives was a Kanjar, and they imply it in the derogatory sense because she comes from that, and they don't say it about the wife that came from the wife, because obviously to them that's okay.
It's been clubbed together, and the clubbing together happened with colonial policy. So there were all these Contagious Diseases Acts where all public women, whether they were elite Tawaif or a more common Kanjari, would be labeled together as one, and the difference would not be appreciated. And Tawaif's knowledge of high literature, because Tawaif would be well versed in poetry, or in poetry, and very literate. They were a literate community. That's the other thing. What we do find is, if you look at Dr. Leitner's report on education in colonial Punjab, he noted that even the most common dancing girl has some knowledge of writing, reading and writing. So again, these were women who were traditionally the ones allowed to read and write. So gender is really interesting, because middle class women and upper caste women were for the longest time not allowed to read and write as well. So I think it kind of, these groups like Tawaif and Kanjri, when you look at their history, it opens up a reflection on wider social prejudice as well, doesn't it?
No, definitely. Just coming to the last kind of few questions. One question that I think is probably screaming out to a lot of people listening is, how does the role of nationalism and obviously Indian independence in play with music, especially in Punjab? Because obviously we have Jallianwala Bagh happen, we have kind of Bhagat Singh and Udham Singh, and we have this rich tradition of fighting for independence. And equally, come to think of it, a lot of say my generation's understanding of say Bhagat Singh may come from movies or songs which have glorified his legacy in a particular way. How then does that all kind of tie into the evolution and the kind of development of music in Punjab?
There is there is certainly a lot of evidence in the 30s and 40s of Punjabi songs written for the nation, so for national, so Qawmi Geet and things like this. And in fact, one of the books found in Bhagat Singh's, uh, the last few things found in, was it Bhagat Singh or another revolutionary? I think it was Bhagat Singh, was Qawmi Geet, which was written by Gurandita Khanna, who had also written a book called Change Change Punjabi Geet. Again, so this guy was also writing pious songs for women, So by the 30s, this idea had kind of become stronger. My Bhagwati was repurposing Sichriya in the 1890s. 40 years later, by the 20s and 30s, the Indian nationalist movement is quite, is on the high, is on the rise. And so that also, music is also songs, nationalist songs are being written at this time. Many of them are performed by Tawai, and the earliest gramophone recordings of these songs are by women who are courtesans. So again, I mean, there was a Tawai Sabha, not in Punjab but somewhere else, I think in UP, who was formed of courtesans who wanted to contribute to Gandhi's fund. Now, Gandhi was very conflicted because he had his own morality, and he didn't know how to deal with these women. But there were these women who were obviously part of the nationalist struggle, and their voices certainly can't be erased or dumbed down. So I think there was participation from all groups for against colonialism, even if not in ways that we are aware of or that made it to the big pages of history.
No, definitely. My penultimate question then, and the last of kind of the serious question, so to speak, what impact does kind of technological advancements have on, I guess, not just the development of music, but also the dissemination of music?
I think technology, not just in terms of the technology of transmission, which is, like you said, radio, television, or gramophone. So I don't really touch on the gramophone era in the book because it's such a rich period, and there was so much that I felt I couldn't do justice to it. So that's not there in this book. But I think I look at technology in terms of the arrival of mass printing and the dissemination of song texts and of hissas, which have songs about different things. So there is that sense of reaching out to a wider public, which happens in this period through printing and literacy, and the gramophone, of course. So there is. It's an interesting time because technology is arriving. In some ways, like new technology, I should say, is arriving and is changing the soundscape of Punjab. So the things you can hear, imagine with the gramophone, there is music coming out of this little speaker, which is something which was not possible before. So it's and this it enters, and now the loudspeaker as well in rural Punjab. It's there on every corner, and there's songs called by Surinder Kaur called like Loudspeaker Ale Mundeya. I think if we look at gramophone, I think the sad thing is the period I study, and I have not looked at gramophone, so there's no way of knowing how these people sounded. It's all in the. But as I said, there is stuff at the Young India Archive on Young India collection on the British Library's website, which people can go and listen to. But then those singers, I don't find records of them in the written record. Or maybe I need to do more research to find out who these people were. So there was this one woman, Badrunisa Begum, who sung beautiful songs, but there is no mention of her anywhere else. So it's like an elusive piece of ephemera where you're wondering, who is this woman? And she sings well, and she's singing in Punjabi, and it's one of those mysteries, right? It's like lost bits of time. So it's hard. It's the challenge of being a historian, I think.
Well, hopefully, or maybe someone listening will do a little bit of research and get in touch and be like, look, I found this, maybe this will help. And hopefully that does help you. My last question, and it's not as serious as any of the other questions, but for someone who studied the kind of the development or transmission of music throughout 150 years, 150 years almost, if you could meet any historical figure from the period that you covered, from Punjab's music scene, who would it be and why? But also, what would be the one question you'd ask them?
Well, I would like to meet Bibi Mora, who was the powerful, first courtesan wife of Ranjit Singh. And, she was named Mora because apparently she could dance like a peacock. So I would very much like to attend one of those performances and ask her who trained her, where she learned her skills, and just have a chat to her about music and religion and the arts, I guess.
No, I will take that answer. I think that's absolutely valid. I have got to the end of all the questions that I wanted to ask you. I just wanted to double check. Is there anything that you think is worth mentioning or something that we haven't covered? Because obviously I don't want to miss anything out.
No, I think the only thing I want to mention is that the one of the chapters in my book is entirely on Mirasis, and it looks at a very fascinating qissa in Punjabi written by a police constable. It's essentially a rant against Mirasis. So it's really colorful and it's really interesting to read. So I've got translations and some transcriptions there. But it's trying to reform the Mirasis, and it's saying Baz Mirasi Put Shaitan, Galgal Denal, Hujat Sunan. So it's saying Mirasis are bad in X, Y, Z ways. Like in so many ways they are bad. And it keeps saying they're bad because they argue, they're bad. So, and that shows us how actually Mirasis are powerful. They're powerful because they argue, because they know so much about you. They can speak in riddles. So I think it's a really interesting text to look at. But I think that's the only thing I thought was left out.
No, thank you for mentioning that. I can obviously just say thank you for taking the time out. I think we've just spent like over an hour or so recording. I've absolutely loved it. So I can only just say thank you for that.
No, most welcome. And you can buy an ebook of this online. For some reason, it's been priced out of most pockets. So if you can ask your library, if you're in an academic institution, to order it, I think the price will come down in a few months, I hope. It'll be more affordable. And I'm sorry it wasn't in my hands, the price of the book. So.
No, that's absolutely understandable. And thank you, obviously, for doing this, because I've been looking forward to it. So, no, thank you for that.
Thank you, Amar.
And that's the end of another intriguing podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating this podcast. A massive shout out to our awesome YouTube members, Jazz Dillon, N Singh, Gary Parmar, Gurpreet Dunjal, Radhaji Kaur, Hunter Hill, Amanveer Mandir, Not Devan, Raj Saran, Vishal Koldar, Sanjeev, Jagraj, Final Ink, Wushu Man, Pavinder Singh, and a little history of the Sikhs. Let's not also forget our amazing Patreon members, including Hernan Pisano, Jazz Dillon, Gurpreet Singh, Gurdeep Bath, Anish Mar, Ramneet Gaur, Rav Singh, Ramneet Gaur, Yasmin Jaswal, Gagan Singh, Gurpreet Dunjal, and Rajvinder Kaur. If you're passionate about the work I'm doing and want to support it, consider becoming a paid YouTube member to unlock some cool features or join our Patreon community. You can find the links in the description below. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll hopefully see you in the next video. Bye!